Welcome to Financially Free Podcast with your host, Nay Torres. One of the reasons Nay could retire when he was 25 years old is because he was coached by the best. And now, through this podcast, so can you.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show. Today, I have the honor of interviewing Mary Buffett. How are you, Mary?
I'm great. Thank you.
Hey, before starting, I really wanted to thank you for your time. It's really a big honor. I started studying investing with your books, and I really appreciate it. And it comes to full circle now. Now I'm talking to you, and thank you so much for this opportunity.
My pleasure, Nay, honestly.
Thank you. Can we start for the listeners that maybe haven't read the books? Who is Mary Buffett?
Well, I was a singer-songwriter in the music industry since I was 14 years old. And actually, I was living at the time in Laguna Beach, and I had a business. I was making skateboards at the time with Tony Alva, who was the world champion skateboarder. And I met Susie Buffett, Warren Peter's sister. So Warren has 3 children, Howard, Susie, and Peter. And Susie lived down there, and we became really great friends. And she said to me, "Oh, you've got to meet my brother. He's a musician, and you've got to talk to him and help him." And I thought, oh, that's the last thing I want to do is meet another musician. I had gotten out of the business, But as it turns out, we met and immediately fell in love, and we met and married in almost 3 months. It was just,
wow.
Yeah, it was really like that. He was living in San Francisco. He had just rented a house that was too big for him. And I was working with a company that was based in San Francisco. And I was going up there, and he said, stay at my house. And I did. And I saw his studio, and we talked all about his business. And I said, you know what, I'll be your manager. I actually, you need help. So I moved up to San Francisco, and actually Susie Buffett, his mom, who had an apartment near us, I stayed at her place, and then shortly after, Peter asked me to marry him, and I said yes, and that was that.
I cannot believe that. Well, I've never heard this story before.
Yeah, and I really, at the time, I had grown up in California. Well, I was born in Chicago, but I really grew up in California, and I went to Beverly Hills High School. So at that time, the only thing I knew about his father was that he owned See's Candy and Blue Chip stamps. I think maybe he hadn't owned Blue Chip. I think Charlie did. But, and I thought, great, free candy. Little did I know there was no free candy with Warren. But I had grown up around plenty of people whose parents were wealthy. But, I didn't see him as a millionaire. He didn't live like a millionaire. It was never really discussed.
And I would love to take this opportunity for this interview to just address that, because I find that incredibly fascinating. You will believe that being around Warren, you start absorbing all this, just how to analyze businesses, pick up stocks. But turns out like Peter was not interested in that. Looks like none of his sons and daughter, it turned out they didn't like it. I mean, maybe they didn't even know what he was doing, right?
Well, I think no, Peter loved music, and that's what his mother, Susie, really, stood behind him. Howie, later wanted to learn more about the business. To be honest with you, I think Susie, little Susie, was probably the most qualified, but at the time, women really weren't thought of in the same way as taking over. But it's a pretty big shadow to walk in, to be honest with you. It would be very difficult to be, Warren's child and get into the same business that he was.
Yes, I agree. He's considered the biggest investor in history, actually.
No one's better. Yeah, 55 years of amazing returns. Nobody's done that.
Could you tell us a couple stories? For example, I bet you have personal stories about the Nebraska furniture mart. He went and bought this huge furniture mart. How did it look like? What happened then? How did you guys find out?
I remember that because we went to Omaha several times a year for vacations and stayed at his house and so on. And the Nebraska Furniture Mart was a very successful, very large furniture store run by Rose Blumkin, who was a Jewish Russian immigrant who didn't read or write, but she certainly knew how to sell carpet. And what she would do she'd go to the suppliers and she would say, I'm going to buy all of your inventory, but you've got to give me a really great price. And then it would allow her to turn around and offer rugs and furniture and everything at really decent prices. And we just remember that people would drive from other, from Iowa, from different states, they'd drive to Omaha just to shop at the Nebraska Furniture Mart. And it was run by her family, her sons. It still is run by the family. And I think it was his birthday. And he went to the Mart and met with Mrs. Blumkin and said, I want to buy the store. And she said, I think it was something like $65 million and not a penny less. And he's like, yes. And he shook hands on it, never looked at the books, understood the business was, really had a lock on everything, and went back and got her a check and made sure that the family was going to still run it because he doesn't want to change management.
So that's how you lived it? Well, because that's what we know now. But back then, did you just know he wrote a check for $65 million and walked into the store?
No, we never heard about the price. Later, of course, I found out. We just, knew that he bought it, and we were like, oh, great. It's just like one time he called me, and we were in San Francisco doing our music, and he called me, and he's like, well, Mary, nobody's getting in my business, so I thought I'd get in yours. I bought ABC, and I was like, oh, great, I'll tell Peter. And I got off the phone. I said, Peter, your dad called and he bought ABC. I wonder what that is. And Peter and I were like, ABC. And then we just looked at each other and realized, does he mean the network? And that was really when people, of course, he bought it with Cap City's Tom Murphy. And that was really the first time people started to know who Warren was, because that was a pretty big, obvious purchase. There were only 3 networks still at that time. That was before cable really took off.
So it's kind of a monopoly kind of economics.
Yeah.
But how did you and Peter feel when you find out, oh, he bought the network?
We were surprised. I mean, for us, my first reaction was great. We write music. ABC has a lot of shows that we can write the music introduction to, but that, of course, never would happen with Warren. You never got a break. I mean, I went to New York and Tom Murphy had organized for me to have I went to ABC and met Diane Sawyer, and I went and met everybody. And I talked to the producers and gave them Peter's and my music, but it never would have happened because Warren didn't believe in that. He didn't believe in helping.
I understand that.
It was very difficult, actually, because people who knew him and then us always assumed we were so rich and didn't need the money. But in fact, we were running a business, and so it made it more difficult. The people's opinion was different than the reality.
Yeah, and I bet if anything that made it harder, because if you start doing something successfully, you're the daughter-in-law of the owner or one of the owners.
Yeah. Well, we never worked for any of his companies. We never got free candy.
It's funny. The other day you were telling me that you went to Nebraska Furniture Mart and you didn't get a discount if it wasn't for Mrs. B.
That's right. Yeah. Mrs. B would give us a discount, and C's candy we would buy every year for the people we worked for. And at the time, Chuck Huggins was the president, and Chuck would give us a discount, but everybody would say, don't tell Warren that we're giving you a discount.
One of my questions is Warren as a father-in-law. He looks to be really radical. I remember seeing this documentary once where he mentioned that he got that inner car from his dad, right?
Right. He did have great respect for his father, and his father was a Republican. And it wasn't until Grandpa died that Warren changed to being a Democrat, because Susie had a lot of influence on Warren, and she was, working for equality for blacks, and she was involved in all kinds of things that were very, very progressive.
And that opens the door to my questions about Susie. I'm really interested in to know the woman behind Buffett, because I don't think we know much about her.
Warren admits to the fact that if it wasn't for Susie, he could never have been who he is. She was his absolute partner in life, and she, basically raised the kids and did her job and left him to do his, because he really worked all the time. So it was amazing. And Susie was one of the most generous, kind people that you would ever want to meet. She always was helping people. She was an amazing, funny person, a total free spirit. Very, very kind of opposite of Warren, but very, she had a lot of friends, and yeah, she was very different. And when she left Omaha, as everyone knows now, she was a singer, and she sang at a place called the French Cafe in Omaha. And the person who was not a waitress, but she sat you down, was Astrid. And Astrid and Susie became friends, and Astrid, I believe, had taken care of a few other older men, making sure they were okay. And when Susie left, she asked Astrid to move in and take care of Warren. And that's what happened. And
really remarkable. Yeah, really remarkable. And it worked for them.
It did. A lot of people didn't understand it. And we would always have, a few weeks at Christmas and New Year's in Laguna Beach together. And Susie would go to Omaha and stay with her best friend, Bella Eisenberg, and go out to lunch with Astrid. And Susie and Warren talked absolutely every day. There is nothing that she didn't know about.
I don't know if I read this in the biography of Warren or maybe somewhere else. I'm not sure how true it is. It's just my memory. But I could swear that U2 singer Bono spent a lot of time with her and said she was the highest emotional intelligence person he had ever met, or something between those lines.
Yes, I would agree. That's a very good way of putting it. Emotionally, she was just an amazing person.
We have some questions from the listeners. Can I start asking you?
Sure.
Yeah, awesome. Let's shoot. How is Warren still alive after drinking 7 Cokes a day?
Well, add to the 7 Cokes, McDonald's hamburgers and McDonald's breakfast and Bronco burgers and C's candy. He thinks, he always thinks that it's all of the whatever it is in Coca-Cola that keeps him alive. So I don't know. And when you go to dinner with him, whether it's at the steakhouse, he literally will take the top of the salt shaker off and pour salt on his steak. So everything that he eats. And once someone asked me, David and I were doing our first book interview with Bloomberg, and I thought for sure they were going to ask me about the zero coupon bonds, and which is a really kind of complicated thing that Warren had just bought. And I was waiting, and the first question he said, "So what does Warren eat for breakfast?" I was like, "What?" And it just so happened that he had been to our house, and I made him breakfast, and it was 2 scoops of vanilla ice cream, some chocolate syrup, dusted with malted milk.
What? Wow. I didn't know it was that bad, because I eat pretty bad. I love Coca-Cola and all of that, so I now have excuse to keep doing it. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. But breakfast ice cream, that's wow.
Yeah, he's basically a child, a kid. He eats like a kid.
Yeah. I bet that's that's where he gets all his energy too, a lot of sugar, just keep running around.
Yeah, sugar and caffeine. Yeah.
How do you think Warren worked all day in the attic for 6 years with his family downstairs? I asked for other investors like I do, because it's very hard working at home, especially doing the kind of mental work he did and the kids downstairs running around. Is he able to just disconnect completely, or was it a big house?
Well, I mean, it was a decent sized house, and of course the attic was separate. But then he also downstairs, he had his TV room and his room where his study. And, he always had the phone, the television, and reading. And he could block anything out. I mean, we always talk about the time that Warren was away. I think he was in New York with Katharine Graham, who owned the Washington Post, and he did too at the time. And during the time that he was away, Susie took up the carpets, and there were hardwood floors, and painted the whole house, and literally changed everything. So he would always park in the garage, come into the kitchen, grab a Coca-Cola, then walk through to his den. And so we were all really waiting for him to, see that the entire house had changed. I mean, there weren't any carpet. I mean, it was totally different. And that day he came in and did the same thing, went to his den, and we all kind of went in there and we're like, well? And he said, what? We're like, do you see anything different? I mean, and he's like, nope, And we're like, the whole house has changed. It's a different color. There aren't any carpets. He absolutely didn't even have a clue. It wasn't, his mind was someplace else.
But maybe he's just wired differently, obviously, right? Don't you think?
Well, yeah. I mean, he's in his head, It's like another time he and Charlie Munger were in New York, and they were walking down the street. They were talking, and Charlie realized he had to catch a flight, and he just went over and got a cab and left and didn't even say anything. And it wasn't but for another block or something that Warren realized, where's Charlie? So they're just in their head.
Is Charlie like that? Did you have a chance to meet Charlie?
Oh yeah, Charlie and his wife used to come down at Christmas time because they were in California, and Nancy, and we'd always have fun with them. And then they came to San Francisco, and Peter and I showed them the recording studio. He had a lot of fun in there, and yeah, Charlie is a great guy. He's not like you see him at meetings. He's not quite as tough. He's actually very sweet.
But they hit it off. It's amazing how they're very logic.
Yeah. Charlie is one of the smartest guys, and he was a great balance for Warren all those years. They both studied under Benjamin Graham, not at the same time. I think Charlie went there first, and then Warren went a year later. So yeah, they're a great complement. What else can I say? They've been together. Charlie, I mean, back in the day in the 60s, in 69, Warren realized that he saw a bubble in the market, and it resembled the 29 market. And it basically stock prices, so-called at that time, the Nifty 50, so if you owned those Nifty 50 stocks, it was impossible to lose. But he noticed that they were so high, preposterously high, that it would be virtually impossible for those companies to earn enough in the future to justify their price. So in 1969, he sold all of them, and he went to cash, and Charlie stayed in the market. But Warren, he went all to cash, and he sat on that cash until 1973. So for years, he just, researched companies. And at 73, when the market tanked, he stepped in and bought companies at bargain basement prices. And Charlie lost a lot of money at that time. So it was after that, in the 60s, that Charlie really became more more interested in what Warren was doing.
You told once in an interview that you went downstairs in the basement where Warren kept a lot of the letters he had written.
Yeah.
And you had a chance to read them, and that you got a chance to see how he thinks. What did you find there?
Oh goodness. They were letters to his early stockholders and family, and every year at Christmas time, that's when he wrote his annual report, his letter to the annual, and he had a lot of those. And what I learned just going through those letters were things like the characteristics that he looked for in companies. Like, for instance, the three characteristics I can think of were, companies that had been around a long time, because he knew that the product that they would sell would be the same 10 years from now, and that makes the earnings more predictable. So, for instance, Coca-Cola, Kraft Foods, Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo has been around since the horse and carriage days, for goodness sake. A lot of the companies are over 100 years old. So that was one thing. And the other thing was that he understood what the companies did. It wasn't likely that a company would have to morph into a completely different kind of business model in order to survive. An example would be Union Pacific, the railroads. They're railroads, not going to change. He loved railroads. And then the other example, I think, was that the company had to have some kind of monopoly, or it would be the low-cost producer in its category, like Nebraska Furniture Mart or Costco. And in terms of a monopoly, most people don't realize that Band-Aid is a registered name by Johnson & Johnson. And even if you don't buy the Johnson & Johnson Band-Aids, when somebody gets a cut or something, you'll say, can you get me a Band-Aid? You still call it a Band-Aid. And that really owns a piece of the consumer's mind. So those were the kinds of things I learned. And also Warren gave me The Intelligent Investor. He's like, oh, Mary, you should read this book. Because he knew I was involved in business. For Christmas, I remember nobody knew what to get him. And I was just like, ay. And then I realized, I'll give him our business returns. I'll show him our balance sheet. And I put it in a nice little plastic cover. And oh my gosh, that was the best present he could ever have.
So you read Intelligent Investor. You realized Warren was buying differently than Benjamin Graham used to.
Right.
Were you ever inclined to invest more like Benjamin Graham, or just stay with the big companies, more predictable?
Yeah, Benjamin Graham had a wonderful, ideas about companies and evaluating them and so on. But he really didn't hold on to them for very long. Sometimes it would just be 2 years, and then he'd sell it at a profit, presumably. But it was Philip Fisher and other people that Warren studied and that made him understand that the long term was really the thing.
Okay, so you don't like, or you never tried nets or these dark, obscure stocks that nobody ever heard of?
Basically, Benjamin Graham taught him that companies that had a durable competitive advantage over other companies were actually the first to recover after the Great Depression. And I think that was really useful in selecting the long-term prospects that Warren was buying, especially in 1973 when he had all that cash.
What would you say is your circle of competence, Mary?
Well, it's changed. My circle of competence obviously was the music and entertainment business for years. And I would say now it's probably financials. It's banks and consumer monopolies, consumer goods, really things I understand. I don't understand tech for instance, very well. But, you know, I did buy Apple, and Warren loves Apple. It's one of his biggest holdings. But, you know, he loves Apple because, you know, it's a great company. I mean, it has very low debt. It makes a great deal of money. It hits all of the things that he loves. So it has all of those business characteristics. I guess that's my circle of competence now. I love banks. Yeah. As a matter of fact, on Buffett Online School, I do a webinar every month with Sean and a few other people. And I think a couple of webinars ago, we talked about banks and why they were good investments. And we went through several different banks and showed their earnings. And the one I did last week, we talked about companies that were going to survive the coronavirus and why and the effect it's had. So there.
Can you tell us again where people can find you?
If you go to Buffett Online School, you can join, and I think it's that easy. Once again, I'm terrible on the computer, so I never go on it. Rarely do I do it, you know. But you can just go to Buffett Online School and ask to join, and it's not that expensive. And then you get all of the webinars, and they stay on there, so you can listen to them again and again.
Thank you very much. And one last word for all the women listening. I am really adamant on asking women listening to the show to share this. I do think that we should promote investing more in women. What can you say as a woman to women that are listening right now and thinking about investing? First of all, I think that women are probably better investors than men because they understand products and brands. And, you know, women have got to realize we live longer than men. We don't get paid as much as they do for the same job. And we generally will spend 13 years of our lives as an unpaid caregiver to children, our parents, our husbands. And so it's more important that a woman take care. You know, I always say a man is not a plan. So we have to be independent. And even if you're married, I would have my own investment portfolio and save my money. I always tell my daughters, you know, oh, you love that cashmere sweater? Well, that $500 in 30 years, they can't stand when I tell them these things. But I'm like, you know, if it's compounding at 20%, that's going to be millions of dollars. So think about that when you want to buy that sweater, when you want to spend $500. It's really that. It's a way, you have to change your way of thinking. And that's what Warren does. You know, he thinks about money in a different way because when he knows, like I used to say, when he drove his old VW Beetle, people thought he was just really cheap, but he knew that $20,000 for a new car back then, in 10 years, if he was compounding over 20%, would be worth, in 30 years, it would be worth $9.9 million. And that was just too much to pay for a car, you know. So that's the way you have to change your thinking as a woman and teach your children at a young age that saving some money and earning some money, even if it's just cleaning up your room or small things, earning money and saving it and putting it away is a good thing. Thank you very much for your time, Mary. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, you've been wonderful. It's been my pleasure. Any time, eh?
Thank you very much. See you in the next occasion.
Okay, bye.
Did you learn something today? How can you apply your insights? What's next for you? The fastest way to make things happen is to just share this podcast episode with more people that may find it valuable too. Talk about it with them and surround yourself with like-minded people. Hope you found this valuable. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.
This podcast references opinions and is for information purposes only, not intended to be investment advice. Seek a duly licensed professional for investment advice.